Time, I'd like to invite Professor Francis Clooney from Harvard University. He is a professor of divinity and comparative theology and director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. He is on numerous editorial boards and is the first president of the International Society for Hindu-Christian Studies. He was also the coordinator for the Interreligious Dialogue for the Society of Jesus. And most recently, he edited an important volume called The New Comparative Theology, Interreligious Insights from the Next Generation. So you can see that he'll definitely have some interesting rejoinders to make, perhaps, to Mr. Malhotra's commentary. So we welcome you, Professor Clooney. Thank you very much.
So I would like to begin by expressing my own appreciation to Balram Singh and the Indic Center for inviting me to be part of this event today. I'm looking forward to our conversation. And to Rajiv for his own openness in the writing of the book. As he mentioned, he had shown me parts of his text in advance and was able to give some comments. And I appreciate the exchange that already is embodied in the book. So I think today's occasion is really an extension of a conversation that began before, and I think all of you will be part of it in a short time. I've always been interested in the India and the West conversation, the exchanges that go on, and as Rajiv said in his presentation, we're by no means at the beginning of that exchange or conversation. Just in the 20th century, I think back to Richard Garby's book, India and Christendom, that came out in 1914, Wilhelm Halbfass, in the 1980s, published in German first and then in English, India and Europe. Raymond Schwab, around 1950, The Oriental Renaissance. And a host of scholars following in the footsteps of Edward Said's Orientalism, including my own teacher, Ronald Inden, from the University of Chicago, exploring the way in which the West has imagined India and drawn India into the consciousness of the West and into the course of Western culture. And I think this exchange has been long overdue to have Indian scholars, Indian perspectives, opening up another way of looking at this relationship by seeing it from the Indian perspective, reimagining the West. Halbfass does a bit of this in his book, tries to look at the West in the Indian eyes, but I think there's much room for much more. My own work over the years in what you might loosely call Hindu-Christian studies has often been premised on the idea that any topic in Western or Christian philosophy or theology can be and needs to be critiqued and put in a different context by seeing what are analogous issues raised in Indian traditions, in Sanskrit, Tamil, and other languages, and to break out of the mold in which we're the only ones who get to set the terms, we're the only ones with a conceptual framework, but to see that the other culture, the other great systems of thought open up ways of looking at the same. And that's why in almost anything I write, I try to look to primary sources, because the exercise of having to learn from the other changes the way one even looks at one's own and punctures false universalism, where it becomes too easy and too general to talk about how we're all the same and so on. Once you begin to study the other, you see in 1,000 ways we are the same, and in 2,000 ways we're different. And I think we learn this. And I'm aware that, again, Rajiv is not claiming to be and is not the first to look at the West in light of India. I think of Swami Dayananda in the 19th century, Swami Vivekananda around 1900, opening up many perspectives and beginning to build bridges in which the Indian voice was much more prominently heard. Coomaraswamy up in Boston, Professor Coomaraswamy, and his very learned essays that draw together esoteric religion with ample doses of Christian mysticism, Thomas Aquinas, and so on. And recently, and I've used several of these authors in class, including Coomaraswamy and Vivekananda, but Sitaram Goel and Ram Swarup, writing in the late 20th century, often very harshly and very critically about the West, but finding that both for myself and for my students to hear these voices is actually important. And that precisely because somebody like Goel or Swarup would be looking at the West and Christianity in a very different way than I would look at it or I would express it, all the more reason to bring it into the conversation. And I think one of the things that has been needed are more sophisticated books, books that are more sensitive to the ambiguities, the dynamics of these exchanges, And I think Rajiv's book is a big step forward in terms of doing what they were trying to do often in their own way, but doing it better, doing it with a greater sensitivity to the complexities, and seeing how the exchange is not simply you attacked us, now we'll attack you, but rather a two-way street in which the conversation now can be carried on with greater sophistication. And I appreciate the fact that Rajiv has made it into a book. I have all my markers here. I was reading it very carefully. Because I think there are many things that can be said in venues like this or in private conversations or for the media in which it's a very fluid conversation. It's hard to pin down what has been said and what does somebody mean. But the discipline and the risk of putting something in writing and publishing the book where you can't easily take it back, it's there now, it's part of the record, actually is a step forward. And I know personally, again, from preaching or teaching, how you can say things and you can even revise as you're speaking. But when you decide to publish something, either in a magazine or a journal or a book in an academic setting, you have to be willing to say, for the moment, this is the best I can do, this is the best I can write. And I know Rajiv, as he's indicated, has thought about these issues for a long time and discussed them in many different venues. The service that he's done, I think, for both people in India, Hindus, and people in the West, including Christians, by putting it into writing, making it a book that can now be carried around, reviewed, discussed, and so on, is a great service. And I'm glad to be part of a conversation around the book. I note finally, as a final introductory comment, and I'll have comments specifically on things in the book, is that this book needs discussion from a variety of angles. And I do think that probably the most important conversation to take place is in the Hindu community. And Rajiv mentioned he just spent a lot of time in India doing precisely that, because I think there's a certain way in which people like me can respond to the book, but the internal dynamics of a conversation in India, people who concerned about the perceptions of the West, wanting to articulate the other voice is absolutely necessary, and that's probably the primary conversation. And so nothing I would say now would be primary. It would be important, I hope, but not the primary thing, because it's the other conversation that works best. Also, many of these issues are highly politicized. And we all know from reading newspapers, watching blogs, and so on, all the time now these things swarm around us in a highly charged political climate in which groups both in the West and in India, Christian and Hindu, are posturing for themselves by making certain claims about the other. And I think this book will invite that kind of politically charged conversation as well, and that's to be expected with a book that has this theme and this prominence. And I think, again, that's a different conversation. I really don't want to get into the political ramifications of what does this book mean in a certain part of India, what does this book mean in areas where there's already a charged Hindu-Christian relation. I actually think the book actually should serve to defuse many of those concerns. But nonetheless, that's a different conversation than the one we might have here. And I think finally I would just say that my concern, therefore, is Professor Clooney up here today. I mean, it could be many different kinds of persons up here, but raising a number of issues that I think have a certain interest in this room, I think, but also in the academic setting. And without reducing the book to those issues, nonetheless, to bring out some points that perhaps haven't been brought out in other contexts. And I'm sorry to say that for the most part I don't have anything terribly controversial to say. So there'll be no fist shaking at Rajiv or yelling or screaming or anything like that, because on many points I think we actually agree. Not that we're the same, but that we actually agree that these things need to be said. One of the services that I think recurs through the book, and particularly in its early parts, is clarifying both where does the modern Western consciousness and intellectual understanding and way of thinking and way of analyzing come from. And I'll come back to this point later, but reminding us and making clear that the modern West has a history, it has a biography, and that there is the Greek heritage, there is the biblical heritage, and there are all the ways in which these have been complexly interwoven over the centuries, and to remind us that the modern West is in itself, even by its own standards, not universal, not a timeless reality, but that what we think of as the rationality of modern secular culture or modern America or the modern world is already deeply embedded in a history that isn't complicated, and I think Rajiv nicely points this out. Also that in many ways over the generations that the West is already indebted to India. It's not simply saying, well, we've given you so many things for so many millennia, now we're willing to entertain a few gifts from you. But rather that this long history, and I won't go into details on this point, but that the West has already borrowed from India. The West has already learned from India. Even in ancient times, ideas coming from the subcontinent to the West have been embedded in and often concealed in the West's consciousness about itself. I mean, back to the days of Alexander the Great and Pythagoras and so on, the way in which ideas came west instead of simply going east. And the need to uncover and pay attention to the fact that you don't have two stable, separate, isolated realities, the West and India, the Christian world, the Hindu world, but these have already been an intertwined history for millennia. This can be worked out, I think, on a particularly small scale. At one point in the book, Rajiv discusses the Jesuit missionary, Robert de Nobili, one of the first Jesuits to seriously learn and study South Indian culture, South Indian Hinduism, apparently learning Sanskrit, although we have very little evidence left of that, but certainly learning Tamil and writing in the Tamil language. And as Rajiv shows in the book, going to great lengths to fit into the culture, dressing as a sadhu, calling himself a Brahmin or a Kshatriya, taking an Indian name, Tattvabodhikar, the teacher of the truth, and so on and so on. And even in a fascinating footnote that you have in the back, I think from Arun Shuri, about the Jesuits saying, oh, if only we could dye our skin so that we would look, we'd have a darker skin and we'd fit right into the culture. The many times I've been in South India, I know that on that level at least I have never fit into the culture. No one would mistake me for a South Indian. But I think de Nobili trying to say just to become entirely part of the culture. And this is a charged issue, because on one level, in my tradition, Jesuit tradition, this is a noble effort to become part of, to communicate, to fit into the culture. But it also can be seen as the wolf in sheep's clothing, a kind of deception, using words like Veda for Bible, Guru for Jesus, and so on, Dharma for the religion. And this, I think it's important to hear both sets of sensitivities. So if we keep having a Western, Christian, Catholic, Jesuit understanding of people like de Nobili, that can become self-serving, because you have to see from an Indian perspective, a Hindu perspective, what it's like to think that somebody came and fit into the culture and then smoothly fit into the culture and then tried to make the gospel as palatable as possible. There are all kinds of issues around that that need to be opened up. One of the further areas for research, I'd say, just as a footnote to that, is that many of the people in India, and not yourself, but who talk about de Nobili, rarely read de Nobili. And that his treatises in the Latin language, that was the common language of the church in the 17th century, are pleading for enculturation, pleading for adjustment to the situation in India, just as in the Greek and Roman world of the ancient Mediterranean. But when he writes in Tamil, and he has about 10 volumes that are preserved in the Tamil language, he becomes a fairly straightforward polemicist. One would think that in Tamil, in the language of the people, he would be even smoother and subtler and saying only nice things and then pulling people in. But he writes a book against Punarjanma Akshepa, against reincarnation. He writes a book showing that the Thomistic understanding of the self, or the Atman, is better than traditional Indian views. He argues the difference between incarnation and avatar, the way in which the Christian veneration of the saints and of images of the saints in church is not at all like the idolatry of the Hindus, and so on. That often the stereotype is smoothly fitting in, trying to look Indian, means that you'll never raise a controversial point because you're trying to pretend everything is the same. When you actually read what de Nobili wrote in the Tamil language, you realize, oh no, he's actually right in your face about the differences. Now, he often thinks, yes, these things are different and I'm right and you're wrong. But nonetheless, he's not concealing, he's rather accentuating the differences. So I think Rajiv opens up another perspective on material of historical importance, and that, I think, is a long history to follow, or a long future in looking at those things. The general idea of the book in privileging difference, or being different, again, I think is a good corrective, as Rajiv made just now in his opening comments. The way in which it can become kind of a lazy identity, an easy, can't we just all get along kind of mentality that doesn't really do us any good in the long run, becomes boring, becomes sterile, and people don't want to do it anymore. Now, on one level, you can say, well, it's actually better that we stress what's in common than killing each other. That's good. But nonetheless, intellectually, smoothing things over and neglecting differences actually is not a useful thing. And then also more on a more cogent intellectual point that Rajiv has made, that there's a certain kind of modern Western universalism that's a kind of amnesia. It's a forgetting again that there's a particular history to the modern West, a history to our ideas, a history to American culture, British culture, German culture, and so on. And then suddenly to discover, and this is the way all people everywhere think, these are the categories that are primary to human consciousness, is extremely misleading. Sure, there are ways in which historically, media-wise, ideas from America and Europe, go everywhere in the world. But to simply claim in a more essentialist fashion that the ideas of the modern West are everybody's ideas, and that everybody can be translated into the categories that we have. So a simple notion of God, a simple notion of religion, a simple notion of truth, a simple notion of reason, a simple notion of logic, a simple notion of history, etc. All of that, I think, Rajiv begins to take apart for us. And that's a very useful point again, is that anybody who claims a kind of universalism that, of course, everyone accepts without doubt is covering over most of the problematic and interesting things that can be said. And I think to see that and to say, sure, there's much that any culture can offer to the world, and there are ideas from the West that should travel everywhere, but to claim that they do so because they're essentially everyone's ideas already is just a historical mistake, and it's often accompanied by a kind of arrogance that needs to be punctured, and I think the book helps us to do that as well. I would distinguish, and I think this is a refrain through the book, how does Greek thinking and biblical thinking kind of come together? And I think one of the interesting things, but it can be a great problem about Christianity in the European context and then the colonial context, is two kinds of universalisms going together. One can be kind of, again, this essentialist, rationalist claim that we all think alike, namely everyone thinks the way we do. The universalism of going and preaching the gospel to all nations converges with that. They hold hands and they go together. But it's a different thing. Going back deep into the history of Israel, as one would have to do, into the prophets, into the sense of the covenants with Noah, the covenants with Abraham, the prophecies of Isaiah, and so on. There's a different sense of the one God of all the nations, which I think it would be wrong to confuse with Western rationalism, universalism. And so once we see the problem, to sort it out and say, well, over here there's a certain kind of secular rationalist problem. Over here there's a question of the biblical heritage, but not to say that they're always the same. And I think that is, again, a follow-up question from the book. Also, and this, again, I don't really want to get in, I'm not competent to get into the politics of this, but it seems that the book in some ways is catching up intellectually with where the world is going today anyway. That we all know, I mean, we read the newspaper every day, look at blogs, look at the media, that the supremacy of the West is in question, and that the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of Brazil, the rise of South Africa, I mean, these great nations that are even economically and then politically holding much greater sway, means that the power balances of the world are changing. And you could argue that a book like Being Different is in a sense part of that great shift that is taking place. You no longer have simply the West, as it has been for most of the past 500 years, but not before that, has been dominant. And therefore, Ken could have said that our ideas are everyone's ideas, as countries like India, Brazil, China, and so on are clearly playing this much more dominant role, even among the bankers and among where the money goes. Obviously, the ideas are going to change. And well, you might say, well, it shouldn't be the case that my ideas are more important if there's money behind them. Nonetheless, people pay more attention. If you say, well, look how India is doing, the ideas need to be taken seriously. Look at South Africa, the ideas need to be taken seriously, and so on. And I think that's all going on, and the book is sort of going where we are in the early 21st century, and that's an important point. Rajiv mentioned the issue of translation. And there's one whole chapter that really deals with mistaken translation, mistaken equations, and I'll just read through some of the list here. Things that are really not the same. Brahman and Ishwara and God. Shiva is not the same as destroyer. Atman is not the same as soul or spirit. The Veda is not the same as the Bible. Dharma is not the same as religion. Jati and Varna are too simplistically translated as caste. Om is not the same as Amen. Dukkha and suffering may be different things. Avatar and incarnation are different. Shakti and spirit. Rishi and guru on the one side, saint on the other side. Karma, yoga, and Christian good works are not the same thing. Notions of suffering are not the same. Salvation and moksha, or liberation, are not the same. And I think in that very pointed chapter, Rajiv goes through all of these fairly briefly, but said maybe there'll be a book to come out of that as well. It's important to know that any of these translations we make have to be tentative acts, efforts to say something in a way that can communicate. But any kind of mindless, timeless equation to say, well, Ishwara and God mean the same thing, or yoga and spiritual exercises are the same thing, or Dharma and religion are the same thing, all of that is not only mistaken historically, but it's also just bad theory of translation. And I think what Rajiv is doing is raising a question that all of the terms we use, and all the ways those of us who teach the religions of India in an American classroom, all of it has to have a sense of tentativeness, where the translations we make can only be approximate. They need to be questioned because the words in English have a life of their own that is different from the life of the words in Sanskrit. And that over time, as Rajiv suggests, maybe it certainly has happened with words like yoga, karma, perhaps. These words become part of English to build a reservoir of other such terms that it's best that we not translate them. It's best that we leave them in the original language. Christian missionaries did this in Asia. I remember the case, I think it was in Matteo Ricci in China. The Jesuits in the very late 16th century, early 17th century, finally deciding that there was no word for Holy Spirit in Chinese, and they start using the Latin term for the Pavitra Spiritus, I think, something like that, because they said, well, anything we put the word into in Chinese is misleading, so why don't we just transliterate the Latin word and leave it at that? And if that can work in that direction, why not have it to work the other direction as well? I would think, though, and perhaps this point could be stressed more than I saw in the chapter, this is the beginning of an exchange, not the end of one. That once one realizes that Shakti is not spirit, liberation is not, moksha is not salvation, a God is not Ishwara, yoga is not spiritual exercise, that's a corrective and a kind of dampening of over-enthusiasm, but also opens the door to much more subtle exchanges. How does your understanding of Shakti change the way I think of spirit? How does your understanding of God with a capital G change the way I think of Ishwara? How do avatar and incarnation correct one another over the centuries? Even apart from the doctrine, many times, one time, if you begin to understand what happens when God comes into the world or takes on a human body, to see that there are different ways of explaining that, very sophisticated, both India and the West, and that the more I read, for instance, about, let's say, Sri Vaishnava South Indian understandings of avatar, that changes inevitably the way I think about incarnation, but it never leads to an equation. I mean, Rajiv is totally right that you would never want to, once you know something about these terms, you'd never want to identify them with one another. So the caution about translating and the caution about equivalences, I think, is not, the point is not to say, east is east and west is west and never shall the twain meet, but rather to say once we have the integrity of the being different, instead of kind of a homogenizing sameness everywhere, then that opens up the possibility of a more mature exchange, analogies of various sorts, in which one can learn from the other. Another issue that Rajiv makes in the book, I think very well, is this analysis of what kind of knowledge is operative in the modern West and what kind of learning counts. And I think this chapter is somewhat, this section is somewhat complicated, and I won't try to go through it, or this theme, I should say, but that it's not the case that Indian ways of thinking are necessarily to be identified with Western ways of thinking. and that there's a way in which, as Rajiv said, I mean, the Western understanding of history is so important and so central, and so many points in Christian doctrine, Christian teaching, go back to the historicity of Jesus. I think in some ways that is a problem for the modern West as well as for traditional India. Why does the Christian tradition in the creed and so on have such kind of historical particularity? That's what it is, but nonetheless it changes the way even modern Western Christians think about the truth of their religion. And there's a way in which, as you rightly point out, Rajiv, in your book, that the interiority, the timelessness, the apprehension of truths that are not historically delimited is much more possible to speak about in the Hindu traditions. And yet there's a way in which the very specific density of historical claims in Christian tradition leads to a different kind of universalism. And I think it's a difficult exchange, and I don't want to say any more about it now, but that the way in which history matters is an excellent point to put on the table. And then to say it's not that those who privilege history less are wiser than those who think history is important, but rather to talk about what do we do, as you mentioned with your Anglican counterpart in the conversations in India, what do you do when we realize point after point we just instinctively think different things are important? One of the things that I thought more could be said on in the book is the knowledge of the Rishi tradition, the Rishis, including Patanjali and the Yoga Sutras and so on. What exactly, how do we know that tradition? How do we know what the Rishis thought? How do we know how they came to know what they know? And then what kind of transmission of that knowledge, what kind of discipline is there to it? So that the Rishis are these intuitive seers, speakers of the realities, and yet that often is put in this Sanskriti framework where it has a very narrowly defined specificity to it after some time. But again, from a Western perspective, the historical question, how do you know what the Rishis said? How do we have any idea what Patanjali's own experience might have been, whether he was even a Rishi at all? But I think opening that door is important. On the Indian ways of thinking, non-linear thinking, which I think is an important issue to raise, as opposed to some models in the modern West, going back to Aristotle in a certain way of linear thinking, the exclusion of the middle ground and so forth like that. I think Indian openness to a certain subtlety regarding multiple possibilities and non-contradiction of a different sort is really key. I've been teaching a seminar this semester on Purva Mimamsa, one of the great darshanas of India, and it's clear again and again that these are reasonable people. These are logically firm, cogent thinkers in Jaimini, Shabara, Kumarila, and so on in the tradition, but the way they're fashioning what counts as an argument, the way they're using Purvapaksha Siddhanta, the way they're thinking about ritual time and space, the way they're thinking about priorities of one rule over another and so on, there's nothing comparable in the West. And I think to be able to get at that and to realize that different ways of thinking are interesting for different reasons and that none of them is simply a poor example of the other, I think opens a great door, and I'm glad you raised those points. All through the book, and I shouldn't say all through the book, but a number of points in the book, kind of in a way I think that it'll make the book easy to teach or useful in teaching, kind of metaphors of difference, chaos and order, the desert and the forest, the joker and the clown, for instance, those vivid examples that come to the fore, that I think are ways of catching differences between India and the West. Any metaphor, any example, chaos and order, joker and clown and so on, if you push them too far, they go poof, and they don't work anymore. But nonetheless, ways of opening up the conversation, I think, is incredibly important. A certain obsession in the modern West with order, rationality, keeping things neat, a fear of chaos. Chaos is bad. Whereas you point out, including on the cover of your book, the way in which there's a sense that the disorder or the dynamic evolution of things where nothing is ever finished or set is instinctively more comfortable in the Indic context than in the West. That's important to point out. I don't think it comes down to the Christian understanding of order versus chaos to a kind of rigid duality. The Christian doctrine of creation, the Christian use of older Near Eastern mythology about the creation of the world, And then the incredibly complicated, chaotic history of the people of Israel seems to be saying, well, this chaotic world in which we live, where human desires are unwieldy, and we never know what people are up to, and God is unpredictable, seems to be saying, if you can't find God in the chaos of the people of Israel, you won't find God. And so, even though you're right, I think that there's a sense of excluding messy alternatives, excluding other voices as Western history moves on. And this could be the Aristotelian heritage. Some of the very biblical material that posits this very strong sense, I am your God, there is no other, also says, I am your God, there is no other, and you endlessly frustrate me, you people. And endlessly I will try again, because the chaos of human existence is never done away with by the greatness of God. And so it's a different understanding that we might talk more about. The desert and forest, just for time's sake, I'll pass over that one, but it's very interesting. What happens in the desert? How does one learn in the desert as opposed to the forest or the jungle? I don't think the desert is simply empty or not, but there's a way in which when you are in the desert, there is only the Word of God, and there's no other, it's like a starkly bare reality that could be done with. The Joker and the clown, two things I'd say. The Joker, your example for the Joker was the Joker from Batman. Particularly the latest, it was at the beginning, the one about the beginning of Batman, the Heath Ledger, who died after making the movie, but this totally frightening, chaotic figure. And I would say it's a kind of nihilism. The way in which the Joker, with a capital J, but maybe with a small j, is into a nihilism where if there is chaos, then nothing counts anymore. Everything is immoral, amoral, a total kind of casting aside of values because the mad individual is the one who rules society. And Batman struggling with that, but in some ways buying into it, and the DA buying into it, and so on like that. Whereas the clown, as you say, in different Indian dramas and so on, ends up reinforcing the order of things. I suspect, just to add one point to that, that the Western history of the clown, not so much the Joker, but the clown, the jester, the fool in Shakespeare's plays and so on, there's a way in which there's a sense that the figure who mocks the king, the clown who plays around instead of being serious, the insistence of medieval monarchs that there be a jester in the court, has something to pick up on. And this would be a very interesting level of East-West exchange, India and the West, instead of just on these very serious large terms, but to, what is the role of the eccentric, the outsider, the Joker, the clown? Needn't come down to the nihilism of the Joker in Batman versus the Vidushika in the Indian plays. But I think you're onto something very important in that way. A couple of points, one more major point, and then I'll just wrap up very briefly because we want to talk about these things. The one area that the book that I had a certain dis-ease about was chapter 3, the integral unity and synthetic unity. And again, I don't mean to say it shouldn't have been done the way it was done. I think it raises excellent questions and is important. But in terms of raising difficult questions, this integral unity, and Rajiv made this point in his presentation, so I won't have to repeat that, but the synthetic unity, trying to put disparate things together that Rajiv perceives as the history of the West. At one point he describes this synthetic unity of the West that's, in quotes, starts with parts that exist separately from one another. So you have many disparate things that then have to be synthesized and brought together. I don't think that actually is the Christian, at least, understanding of the synthesis. That the very idea that God created the world out of the chaos in some sense means that all through its history, from the moment of creation for all eternity thereafter, God is forever creating the world, and that everything that exists is in some way dependent on the creative will of God. And that it's not so much like a bunch of things in the world that somebody's trying to put together and synthesize. It's not, you're right, totally right, it's not the yogic integral synthesis to which you point. But there's a way in which the intentionality of God, let there be light, let the world be in order, is a different kind of synthesizing, but it's an incredibly potent spiritual synthesis that perhaps deserves a little more patience than you gave it. The 4 inherent problems in the West, on page 145, Rajiv lists 4 of them: deficiency of the inner sciences, anti-intellectualism and the absence of debate, reason, and cosmological exploration within the core Christian scriptures, external projection, the wrong quest for freedom by the Western ego, are all points we need to take seriously. And some of your predecessors, such as Ram Swarup, have raised questions about the sharp contrast between the yogic integral understanding of self, and you don't, when you read the Bible, you don't pick up on that. You don't see yogic exercise or integral learning of that sort. But it seems that on all of these points, I think you make a good point, but perhaps I wasn't entirely persuaded that there aren't other elements and resources in the Western and Christian tradition and in the Bible itself about the discipline, the integration of learning that enables us to see how things fit together. There's a way in which, and you weren't doing this, but it allies itself, somebody could ally it with a certain kind of sense that the Old Testament was just ritual, the Old Testament was just external, the Old Testament was just the law, and that as I understand from my limited study of the prophets and so on, there was actually a great effort to rethink law in terms of community, rethink law in terms of the sovereignty of the will of God, and the ritualism is always a danger to be overcome. But then the rabbinic tradition, which is not Christian, and yet draws on the law and the prophets, I think had incredibly creative ways of thinking alternatives to modern secularity and rationalism, and alternative to the Christian synthesis that shouldn't be left out of the picture. And I leave it out usually. But I think in terms of what happened to the biblical heritage, to listen to the rabbis more about their understanding. And as you know, at the AAR over the years, Judaism and Hinduism have often been in dialogue, and that's a great thing. But a little bit more sympathy at that point, I think. The incompatibility of Christian dogma and Greek reason. And I think that can be misleading in a way. I mean, there's a point in which the creed and so on have all kinds of paradoxical claims that are hard to explain. And if you ask any average churchgoer coming out of church on Sunday, they're very hard to explain. And the idea that Christ is truly God, truly human, the one eternal Son of the Father, and so on, this can be seen as a great burden. But the Greek reason is already in there when the Christian dogmas become dogmas. So the primal stories of Jesus in the Gospels, for instance, are not the dogmas. The dogmas come hundreds of years later when the early Christian intellectuals are drawing on the Greeks and putting these things together. So I wouldn't quite put it in the same way, Christian dogma and Greek reason as incompatible, but that perhaps Greek reason drew out of the Christian sources certain kinds of dogmas that constantly are slightly incoherent, that there's a level at which inside the Christian synthesis there are elements of dis-ease because these pieces don't fit together. But Greek reason was part of it from extremely early on, before we actually had anything that we consider in the creed. A footnote here, Rajiv made me go back and read Matthew Arnold, his book Culture and Anarchy from 1869. Matthew Arnold, the poet, literary critic, has this wonderful little book, which I have not read carefully, but I did go back to it, on thinking about the heritage, the dual heritage of the Greeks in the Bible, or as he puts it in the key chapter for this purpose, Hebraism and Hellenism. And the way in which he's very nice about it, but arguing that even though we see ourselves in biblical or Hebraic tradition, it's really not the same thing as the Hellenic or Greek tradition. And that these things are, we often talk about them, he says, as if the biblical worldview won out and the Greeks were subdued and brought in. But actually, when you look at it closely, there are all kinds of ways in which these things don't fit together, and there's a great tension there. And I think by the end of what Arnold is doing, at least in my quick review of it, he's arguing that, very much as your whole book does, that once we realize that the biblical heritage and the Greek heritage are not the same thing, they're different, there are different dynamics, it's tricky to keep them together, then the biblical heritage has a better future because it's not pretending to be Greek reason. And I think, in a way, using Arnold would be a whole fascinating thing to go read that chapter in particular on Hebraism and Hellenism again and have a discussion about his insights into how we think about the issues today. So I'm glad you pointed that out. But I think it doesn't go toward the absolute static incompatibility of the Greek and the biblical, but rather that the problem of keeping these together always has to be rethought in a new way. On page 154, I'm almost done, the 5 problematic synthetic movements, the emergence of Rome and the birth of Western Christendom, Renaissance and Reformation, Enlightenment and the birth of modern science, Oriental Renaissance, colonialist expansion, is again a very trenchant set of 5 problematic syntheses that we need to go back and look at, particularly in terms of the way they affected the rest of the world. But in some ways here, it can also be taken as another version of the modern West story about itself. So there's Rome, the birth of Christendom. Let's skip the Middle Ages and go to the Renaissance and the Reformation. The Reformation leads to the Enlightenment and modern science. That leads to the new reception of the East, and then colonialism. And I think in some ways it's always been a problem in the West. Let's skip the Middle Ages. Let's skip the Catholic heritage. Let's forget about the Greek Orthodox and Eastern rites altogether. And that the way in which, if we're going to talk about Christianity in this context, you're rightly picking out a number of allergic dualities and problems that need to be faced. But I think all of them need further study, and I think you'd agree with that. And then if it all sort of leads up to colonialist expansion, is kind of this is where the West was heading. There are triumphalist Westerners who think that the whole point of the 19th century was finally to dominate the world and make everyone European or make everyone American. But I think there have always been the skeptics and the counter voices in the Western tradition, particularly in Christian traditions, who say that this idolization of the modern West is a great mistake and that we have to turn back from that. So I thought some of that could be nuanced. I'm sure will be in further discussion. Finally, where do we go from here? And I'll stop with this. Several points in the book, Rajiv puts forward a very prudent and I think one that we can all keep list of how we go about this. On page 50, what we need to do if we're going to have any decent conversations, a recognition and reduction of difference anxiety on both sides, a willingness to articulate and understand major differences, both in terms of philosophical, theological debates and actions, a negotiation of the thorny issues of history-centrism, exclusivism, aggressive conversion in the West, a less passive attitude toward real-world issues and religious differences on the part of Dharmic practitioners, so each side gets challenged here, and an understanding of the need to reform and correct the self-aggrandizing and self-referential institutional networks that produce cultural analysis, including academic institutions, foundations, the media, and publishers. And one of the things that Rajiv is famous for is giving everyone at the American Academy of Religion a hard time and scholars who study Hinduism a hard time. And I think this puts it very nicely in terms of it's not just nagging or picking away at people, but there's a larger, much more kind of, you might say, civilized program of conversation that needs to take place in which the necessity comes of raising uncomfortable questions for the other. This is repeated, and I won't read all of it, at the end of the book on page 339, where Rajiv adds to it the fact that the point of the conversation, once it's on a level playing field, is not that one side wins by converting the other, but on the second level, we're not out to intellectually convert everyone. On another level, there's no reason to think it's a win-win situation all the time. There may be situations in which one side has to concede, you're right, this doesn't actually work. This is not coherent. We've been mistaken in thinking about it this way. And how to keep the balance of kind of a civil, humane, decent respect for one another and avoid competition, and yet also be able to say this is not win-win. In certain cases, I may lose, certain cases, you may lose, in a sense, by having to give ground, which ultimately would be to our gain. I think where this leaves us, 2 things, and then I'll stop. One would be the book raises fascinating questions about how this future conversation is to continue. The problem is, with whom does it continue? And it seems that, as you were saying, you already were discussing the book in India with swamis and business leaders and students and so on. Here we are today. I'm sure there'll be other venues in the West, or have been already. Different conversations have to proceed differently. And the kind of academic conversation among experts who are, scholars of Western history, scholars of Indian history and so on, is one conversation. The great kind of photo ops of leaders sitting down and talking to one another is a different kind of conversation. The popular conversation, let's say where a book like this would be used in the classroom in India, is a different conversation, and these have to be kept distinct. because what you might say about the book in a context like today or an academic setting is not really the way it would be received or talked about in a classroom in Delhi or a classroom in New Jersey. And neither of those is what the Pope and the Swami will say to one another when they meet. But I think part of the agility of this conversation has to be to say, we can't all engage in the same conversation in the same way at the same time. So we have to know who we're talking to and what kinds of issues are at stake. So you're not going to be rereading Matthew Arnold with everybody in the conversation. And with other groups, you may be saying, let's talk about the clown and the joker, or let's talk about the desert and the forest. And so different levels need to be sorted out. But I think the last main point, and you make this a number of times at the end, is if we're aware then that differences do matter, that being different is a virtue that we need to uncover and give more room for, this leaves us with an enormous amount of work to do. Because it's so easy to say, we're radically different, I'm not interested in you, I'd like you to go away, leave it at that. Or we're all the same, and there's really nothing here to think about, nothing to learn, because no matter what you say, it's the same as what I say. Once we push those lazy alternatives off stage, then there's an incredible amount of research to do, incredible amount of way, not only for Westerners to chasten and redo the way we talk about India and Hinduism, but for learned intellectual Hindus to start knowing the West with a great deal of sophistication and in much more subtlety than has often been the case in the past. But I'm grateful to you, Rajiv, for doing the book and for raising all these issues in a way that opens rather than closes down conversation. So thank you. Thank you all.